Hi everybody, it's Katie Snyder at Museum of the Grand Prairie in the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. I'm here in our exhibit, How Long Must Women Wait? Women's Suffrage and Women's Rights in Champaign County. And I'm here with two friends that were in a march in 1913 for suffrage, which means getting the right to vote. And that march is going to be mentioned in the book we're going to read today. The book we're going to read today is called Miss Paul and the President, The Creative Campaign for Women's Right to Vote by Dean Robbins, illustrated by Nancy Zhang. And I'm with these two friends today because they went to this march in 1913. This is Miss Lilybelle Sale. She was the mother of Chick and Virginia Sale, who were both vaudeville performers. Now, you might not know the word vaudeville, but it was like singing and dancing and telling jokes on a stage. So that's the way people kind of got famous back in the day. And what she did for a living is she was an attendance clerk, like checking kids in that came to school in Urbana schools for over 20 years. So if you went to Urbana schools way back in 1913, which I don't think you did, but maybe when your grandparents did, or your great-grandparents, you might have known Miss Lilybelle Sale. So she worked as an attendance clerk, but she also was an activist for the women's right to vote. This over here, her name is Eliza Vincent. She came from Rantoul, and she was a teacher in the Urbana school system, so she worked for Urbana school system as well. Now, both of these ladies marched in the parade that we're going to hear about, representing the state of Illinois, which is where we are. Now, in this march in 1913, another woman you might have heard of, Ida B. Wells from Chicago, a black woman, she also marched in this march in 1913. However, she was not really allowed to march. She was told not to march. All the African American women that were working for women's right to vote were asked or told, actually not asked, told, to go to the end of the parade and not march with their state, but march on their own as just black women together, not black women from the state of Illinois or any other state. So they were not allowed to represent their state. However, Ida B. Wells didn't think that was such a great idea. She did not like that idea, and that is, that makes a heck of a lot of sense. So she said, nope, like if I'm gonna have to march in the back, I'm not gonna march at all. So she waited at the side of the march. She saw all the women marching by, and when the state of Illinois, with these two friends, walked by, she joined in the march and marched along with them. So in the end, Ida B. Wells did march with the Illinois constituents, but she wasn't allowed to. She took it upon herself to go into the parade. Sometimes people say, if there's not a seat at the table for you, make a seat at the table, pull up a seat. That's kind of what she did. She pulled up a seat, which was a great thing to do. It was a really brave thing to do at the time. So we're going to hear about that march in here, but they're not going to mention that. That's why I wanted to mention it first. Miss Paul and the President. Because this is more from the point of view of Alice Paul. So it doesn't go into the whole Ida B. Wells thing. It doesn't go into these two women's experience, but I wanted to give you a little local flair. So, Alice Paul hurried up and down Pennsylvania Avenue in a purple hat. She wanted to make everything perfect for her parade, a parade no one in Washington, D.C. would ever forget. Kind of interesting that they said her parade. I kind of think it would be the parade of all the women, but that's the point of view they took in this book. Alice double-checked the 26 floats, and the 10 bands, and the dozens of dancers. She took her place with 8,000 other women. They wore colorful sashes and carried brightly painted signs. See those colors? Often you'll see over and over again the purple and the white and the gold, which were the suffrage colors. Alice held onto her hat so it wouldn't blow off in the wind. She led the women up Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. People lined the sidewalks to see the hullabaloo. Some of them cheered, but many jeered. No to votes for women, they called. Alice expected the jeers. Women couldn't vote in the United States, and most Americans didn't think they should. She hoped her parade would help change their minds. Once again, I'm going to say it was probably a parade of all those women. She organized it, though, which is a great thing. A mile away, Woodrow Wilson rode a train to Washington, D.C. The new president of the United States adjusted his spectacles, that's glasses. His daughter, Margaret, straightened his top hat. "Thousands of people will be here to meet you," she said. "You should look your best." President Wilson stepped off the train and waved. But no one waved back. The station was almost empty. The whole city had gone to see Alice Paul's parade instead. Who was that determined young woman in the purple hat? So they didn't show up for the new president because they were coming out for the Women's March. Alice Paul grew up on a farm. She liked to make mischief right along with the boys in her town. They snacked candy, they chased chickens, and they threw mud balls. And I guess back in that day, that wasn't typical for a girl, so that's why they're saying made mischief right alongside the boys. Every 2 years, Alice watched her father go off to vote. Her mother had to stay at home. Why should it be that way? Alice read about her country's laws. The Constitution promised that people could elect their own leaders, but it also said that only men could vote. Weren't women people too? Shouldn't they be able to vote as citizens of the United States of America? Good question. Alice found books on women's suffrage. She learned that suffrage meant the right to vote. Suffragists wanted to change the Constitution so women could help elect their own leaders just as men did. They needed to convince the president and Congress, but the politicians in Washington, D.C. wouldn't listen. Oh, Alice had lots of ideas for making them listen. When she was old enough, she joined other suffragists who demanded the right to vote. She impressed these women with her big parade on Pennsylvania Avenue. She impressed them even more when she set up a meeting with President Woodrow Wilson himself. President Wilson wanted to see the woman who had caused the hullabaloo. He thought she might apologize to him. After all, she had stolen the spotlight on his first day in Washington, D.C. Alice did not plan to apologize. She sat down in the president's office and looked him right in the eye. "Mr. President, will you support the vote for women?" she asked. The president did not expect so bold a question from this small woman in a purple hat. "Miss Paul, the time is not right. I have many more important problems to worry about." Seems like throughout history, people have always heard when they wanted to make a change, but the time was not right. Not a good thing to say, because, like, if not now, when, right? President Wilson got to work on his problems. Alice got to work too. She opened an office in Washington, D.C. for a new group called the National Woman's Party. Thousands of women joined. They called Alice their dear little leader. The dear little leader wanted to show the president that women's rights were as important as anything else in the United States. She would do it by making mischief, just as she had on the farm. Kind of like making trouble, right? Making good trouble? Margaret Wilson stared out the White House window. "Father, come look." Alice led a fleet of fancy cars up Pennsylvania Avenue. Women honked their horns and waved their yellow flags. You have to remember, back then it was brand new to even have cars. And women were getting a little independence by learning how to drive cars. Congressmen came out to the Capitol to find a long scroll unfurled on the marble steps. And it said, "Support the vote for women." That's not unlike some graffiti signs we've seen in the streets that say Black Lives Matter, right? People have always wrote their messages in the streets. A funny-looking train chugged from the East Coast to the West Coast. Alice had named it the Suffrage Special. The train stopped in towns along the way, and families came out to gawk at it. Women made speeches from the caboose. Send a letter to the president, tell him to support the women's right to vote. And that's not so different, is it? Nowadays, people send emails and make phone calls to people in power when they want to make a change. President Wilson got bags of letters from all around the country. They piled up to the ceiling in his office. But the president had other problems to worry about. He didn't take time to read the letters about women's suffrage. So Margaret, his daughter, read them instead. That's interesting. That winter, Margaret sat next to her father in the president's car. A strange sight greeted them at the White House gate. Women strode back and forth carrying signs. President Wilson spotted Alice at the front of the group. She looked him right in the eye. The president glanced down at his newspaper, but Margaret waved at Alice through the window. And if you come to visit us, you'll notice up front we have a photo booth that has a picture of the White House where the women were protesting out in front, and they called themselves the Silent Sentinels. Alice and her friends paced in front of the White House day after day in the freezing cold, just like in our photo booth. People lined the sidewalks to see the hullabaloo. Some of them jeered, but many cheered. They brought scarves and mittens to help keep the women warm. The police ordered Alice to leave the White House grounds. "Not until the president supports women's right to vote," she declared. The police put the women in handcuffs and took them off to jail, just as Alice had hoped they would. So just like today, people go to protest back then knowing that they may get arrested, but kind of hoping that they would so that they could get the idea of their cause out there in the public, in the newspapers. That's not unlike what happens today either, right? Some brave people are willing to be put in jail for those kind of things. President Wilson did not like the thought of Alice in jail. He knew she loved the United States. Why else would she go to all this trouble to vote in her country's elections? "Maybe women's suffrage is more important than I thought," he said. Margaret looked her father in the eye, just the way Alice Paul had. "Yes, to the vote for women," she said. The president would make a speech, an important speech. So, sometimes people think protests are not useful, but really sometimes people protesting, many times, people protesting have led to big change. So Woodrow Wilson saw these women protesting for almost a year, every day. And finally, he was ready to make a change. Alice stood with others from the National Woman's Party. She wondered what the president would say. Woodrow Wilson adjusted his spectacles. Margaret straightened his tie. People all over the country will read about your speech, she said. You should look your best. The president faced the crowd. The time is right. I will ask Congress to pass a law giving all women the vote. The women waved yellow handkerchiefs and threw yellow flowers. 3 cheers for President Wilson, they shouted, and 3 cheers for Alice Paul. Because she and all those other women are the ones that made Woodrow Wilson change his mind. 2 years later, Alice skipped down Pennsylvania Avenue to vote in the 1920 election. She filled out her ballot and she raised her arm in victory. So that, boys and girls, was 100 years ago when white women got the vote. And really, it wasn't until the 1960s that African Americans with the Civil Rights Act had the ability to vote, because sometimes things are on paper, but they're not really true in practice. And we have talked about that in some other stories, and it is really important to note that in 1920, women got the right to vote. In practice, white women, in theory, all women, and in practice in the 1960s, black women, and as we all know, there are even people that are trying to suppress the vote today in different ways. So, getting the vote is not something that we can just kind of check a box and say, hey, it's good, we've done it, it's good for all people. We have to be ever vigilant, ever on guard, and those of us that have the privilege to vote have to make sure that all citizens have that same privilege to vote. And we all have to continuously fight voter suppression. Okay, nice to talk to y'all. See you again another time. Bye-bye.